Welcome everybody. This is just the introduction to week 3 of our subject, and we're looking this week at the nature of bilingual speakers. And whilst the images I've put here are actually books, I do want us to be thinking about this idea that bilingualism is not unusual and it's not weird and it doesn't stop us learning other languages. That we see bilingualism as a useful tool, a great language resource for learning English as well as other languages. And so this week we're going to be looking at some clips of people, children who are bilingual speakers, and really think about what's happening in that experience of being bilingual, because it's not an even distribution of languages. So bilinguals are people who use more than one language. So it's not just two, even though we know bi means two, rather than saying bilingual, trilingual, quadrilingual, quinlingual. We tend to say bilingual even when we mean more than one language. We can say multilingual, but it's usually to mean two or more languages, so in use as well. One of the problems, I guess, about language is it's often written from a monolingual perspective. So the question is, who's judging who? Are we making bilingual to be the, oh my goodness, look at that, when actually it's the way that most people in the world live. In fact, the monolingual perspective is that, oh my goodness, why would you do that? So we need to keep in mind, I say we, those who might be monolingual, I do have other languages, but I grew up monolingual. I had no really understanding of bilingualism when I left Australia to live overseas in a multilingual situation. So this idea of sometimes things have been written from a monolingual perspective, judging a bilingual experience as somehow being inferior. So just be aware, from a critical literacy point of view, be aware of what might be written and how it's being written. What is that normal that we're talking about? And of course then the question is, who has more power in the world, the monolingual or the bilingual? I guess we could put this another way in saying, who has the power, what languages become powerful in particular settings, and I mean particular settings, not across the board. So do you have more power when you speak one language really well, or do you have more power when you can move between languages? Certainly there are communities in Australia where I would have no place or no power or very little because I don't speak the language that's being used in that particular community or that particular setting. However, English does have this strange place in the world where it's sometimes judged as being, oh, you are so lucky you have English. But we need to think about, is it English or is it monolingual? Is it bilingual? What's happening there? Bilingualism with English, what does that give people? And that gives lots of ins. Can I tell you, that's probably a very powerful place in the world, I think. Multilingual with English. And so then we're going to be asking you to think about what it is. What do you think? What's your feeling about languages used by others? So it's really just trying to think, what do I think about language? What do I think when people are speaking another language? And your own perceptions, as long as you understand them, I guess, is more than I'm asking you to change them, but being able to understand that your perspective means that you then react a particular way, for good, not for evil, but sometimes your own reaction can be something that might stop other people learning, and that's something to think about, as well as if your own reaction can be really helpful for people to be able to learn and to have some space to learn. So just keeping that in mind. So our readings this week, the first one is from our set text, which you can access online, the Cook and Singleton text, and we're looking at how different languages connect in our minds. So we're really focusing on the bilingual. Again, may have many languages. There's particular definitions of bilinguals. So when you look at the two definitions that Cook and Singleton offer, which one do you prefer? Which one is maybe you had before you started the subject, maybe you're starting to change a little bit. I'm not asking you to change, but you may be thinking about which one do I really think about when I think about this idea of bilingualism. Lots of facts and figures about bilingualism, and you'll notice that they are quoting the source that you are familiar with Ethnologue, which has a lot of, it's just an amazing clearinghouse for lots of interesting facts and figures. I say interesting because, I'm a number nerd. I love that sort of thing. hope you do. And also it looks at the characteristics of bilinguals. One of the ideas that Cook and Singleton bring up, and the types of bilinguals. So both the characteristics and then the various types. And this is very much around when people learn a second language, where they use a second language. So we're looking at not just it's all one thing. There are characteristics that we can, it's good if we sort of know what those characteristics are, because then that helps us to tap into our English teaching as well. And one of the ideas we've already talked about a little bit, looking at code switching and what it means to code switch when you have another language. So I think we've actually started this, so some of this will be quite familiar to what we've been to when you go to read it. And there's some questions on page 14. We'll talk about these in class, so have a think about it. The reason I'm suggesting that you read Cook and Singleton first, it's a very accessible book. It's very, so it chats to you a little bit. And there's also the pull-out boxes. There's little quizzes you can do as you go along. What do you think? So I would say as you are reading, maybe interact with those boxes. Give yourself a little bit of time to do that. Don't do it just before you come to the tutorial. So you're really interacting with the material and then beginning to think about some of those ideas that you had never thought about before. But the questions on page 14 we'll bring to in class. The second reading is from Colin Baker's work, and it's one of those distinctive texts about bilingualism. We need to keep in mind that Baker's work is often in that additive bilingualism, the middle class bilingualism. So his work is in Canada and looks at people who are learning language to sort of further their academic and position, that sort of thing. So it is coming from a particular area, but it's very good for looking at some of these definitions that we want to be able to use and give you some language to be able to think about, to help with your thinking about bilingualism and other languages and people using languages to get to English. So one of the ideas that he brings up is this idea of individual bilingualism and societal bilingualism. So for you, what are the affordances? What are the advantages? What can you draw on? Opportunities for education. So if you have societal bilingualism, what does that give us? Sometimes over, not necessarily, but individual bilingualism. Once you've read Cook and Singleton, a lot of what you're reading in Baker will just be adding on to what you've just been reading. So some of these dimensions of bilingualism, I think that should be, the factors that affect becoming or being bilingual or multilingual. So I think the two readings are going to support each other. You'll be able to read this a little faster because you've read the Cook and Singleton reading. Again, examples of bilingualism. And some of the negative ideas attributed to bilingualism by monolinguals. So sometimes this idea that a bilingual is two halves of a monolingual, which isn't quite right. It's probably more than a monolingual, but some of the ideas that maybe you've heard, maybe are in our communities, about people who use other languages. So, and if you are bilingual yourself, you might be thinking about, do you sometimes think this is yourself as well, and maybe not seeing the great resources it is, or have you heard these sorts of things said? You might want to think about that a little bit, and if you feel comfortable, bring that to class as a comment to make. So it's really, the reading is trying to take up a positive view of bilingualism, which no surprises for knowing we are espousing in this subject. So looking at what bilingualism offers us in terms of teaching English. And I would say it's a bit of a long reading, so if you can just get to the top of page 13, that would be terrific, because you'll get a lot of the ideas that we want to talk about in the tutorial. And just a few other ideas that might help you in your thinking about these readings and thinking about your interviews, profiles with people, and thinking about just language. This idea that we have productive and receptive language. You may have come across this already in your studies, but the idea that we receive language and we produce language. So our receptive language skills are not always the same as our productive language skills. So, and often with when we have more than one language, we are doing things quite differently. So you, not always, but you often find people can speak a language that they can't write. And sometimes this leads to people calling these lesser languages, or sometimes dialects, when it's not a dialect, it's just a spoken language. So people can speak, but they don't know how to write the language. And the opposite of when I think we mentioned in the lecture this week, in my experience in Japan, other people have had this in languages where people can write a language, write English, but they can't speak it. So they can write beautifully and they can compose, they can produce language, written language, but they can't produce it. I myself, I can sort of receive Portuguese. Rather, I can hear it, I recognise it, I get words, I get a general gist, so I can receive it as a spoken form. I'm pretty bad producing it. I'm charming, but not very communicative. When it comes to reading, I can read Portuguese pretty well. I know what's going on, but I can't write it at all. So receptively, I'm stronger in reading Portuguese because I've had to deal with a lot of documents in Portuguese and understand what's going on. So I can receive written Portuguese better than I can receive spoken Portuguese. I'm pretty bad at producing spoken Portuguese. I'm really hopeless at writing Portuguese. So it's not always, I wouldn't say I was a great bilingual, but I do have a use for Portuguese. So I find I'm usually good at producing in languages much better than I'm receiving as well. So I can chat away in Tetum. I used to be able to chat away in Japanese, but I wasn't so good at being able to hear and process quickly enough to receive it very effectively. I don't know if this is giving you confidence or not. So just be thinking about languages that you might have and where you might sit. Again, these are the sorts of things you might want to ask your respondents. Don't use the word receptive and productive, but what do you understand? What can you say? What can you read? What can you write? Those are your questions you're going to be using. So we've got this listening and reading as our receptive and speaking and writing as our productive. So again, which modes of language are stronger or weaker depend on how they were learnt and what's available to support the receiving and producing. Again, if there's nothing to read, your receptive and productive, or your receptive reading skills receptive language skills are probably quite poor if there's nothing to receive. If you've got nothing to write about, again, that's what we sometimes see in testing, and it's one of the questions we have in Australia about NAPLAN. If it's not a good question, does that help our productive language? So there's nothing to write. Again, if you've learnt things in school, if you've learnt them at home, if you've learnt them in the community, or as a taxi driver telling me once, I learned to speak English by listening to American rock songs. I'm imagining your receptive language is in a particular domain, and that means your productive language may stay within that domain. So some interesting things that you could get from English and that. So again, how you've learnt the language is going to make all the difference. And so because these are many aspects of language you'll focus on when talking with your respondent and analysing your data. So I'll leave you with those few ideas for this week and hope that gets you thinking, which will help you to read better, to be receptive to the ideas and have lots to produce in your tutorial this week. We'll see you then.